The loneliest people, if you're considered lonely by the UCLA Loneliness Index, you're likely to live 15 years shorter. It's the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Boys from unmarried homes are far more likely to be suspended in school. And the collapse of marriage and healthy relationships is at core of the mental health crisis.
Please explain who you are and what your focus is.
17 years ago, a close family member's family failed, and we ended up taking in her 4 kids. My wife and I saw what happens when families fail. I founded a ministry that exists to equip the local church to share the gospel. The reality is those who are happily married are the happiest people in all of society. Would you rather have a life that you can suffer with someone, where that suffering can be life-giving, rather than life-taking and life-destroying?
JP De Gance, welcome to Real Talk with Zuby. How you doing?
Hey, Zuby, I'm great. Thanks for having me.
No doubt. It's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to this conversation. JP, for my listeners who are not familiar with you and your work with Communio, please explain who you are and what your focus is.
Yeah, well, I founded a ministry that exists to equip the local church to share the gospel through the renewal of healthy relationships, marriage, and the family, right? We think the collapse of marriage and healthy relationships is at core of the mental health crisis, the crisis of meaning in the West, and it's also, of course, at the heart of the fertility crisis. When we talk to church leaders, we note that this crisis is actually driving the decline of Christian faith across the West, and so we operate in this space where we serve the church. We believe that the church is the best solution for the crisis, and so we want to take I describe it as a John the Baptist approach. We want to decrease. We want the local church to increase. And so we work with more than 400 churches across the United States in 32 states to serve them in this mission to bring revival through the renewal of marriage and the family.
Awesome. Sounds like a very important mission. What is it that made you want to get started with this?
Yeah. So like a lot of people in the U.S. who are maybe more conservative, I came to Washington, D.C. because I wanted to save the country by focusing on politics first. I met my wife, then my girlfriend at school at the University of Florida, and because of her encouragement to go on a retreat, I met some folks who got me going on a professional journey that brought me to D.C. And then about 17 years ago, a close family member's family failed, and was in an abusive marriage. And we ended up taking in her 4 kids. They were 10, 11, 14, and 15 at the time. And my wife and I saw what happens when families fail. And we thought it might be a short-term situation, ended up being a long-term situation. And that God started work in my heart to see what's really important, and recognizing a lot of stuff that I was working on in politics was just downstream of the collapse of faith and family. And so I had learned a ton of things in both the political world and the private sector, and started asking the question, what would it look like to take a lot of the strategies, techniques, technologies, baptize them, sanctify them, bring them into the service of the church, and find ways to in an evidence-based way, improve marriage and family outcomes, faith outcomes, and that got me. We started a pilot initiative in Jacksonville, Florida, where we ended up working with 93 churches across Duval County, with my good friend Richard Albertson and his ministry Live the Life, and we ended up lowering the divorce rate by 24% in 3 years across the county. Before we had gotten going, Jacksonville was rated by Men's Health magazine as the 6th worst city in America for marriage. The Huffington Post wrote a article that before we had gotten started, and said that these are the 10 cities where marriage goes to die, and Jacksonville was one of them. And by the time we were done with our pilot, Jacksonville had the lowest divorce rate of all large counties in the state of Florida. It had never, prior to our work there, had a divorce rate lower than the average divorce rate in the state of Florida, and it had sharply declined below that. So we realized we found some things that were really working. And in the years following that, 2019, 2020, 2021, we were trying to develop a go-forward business model of how we can really take it to scale. And we realized that it was the local church was our unit of change and the unit to scale through. And we began to develop much more of the business processes to serve the local church. We're a nonprofit ministry, but our work is offset by fees paid for by our church partners. And so that's allowed us to get to where we are now across the country and working in really across a number of denominations. We work with the Southern Baptists. We work with the Church of God, Assemblies of God. We have Catholic partners. Fundamentally, if you're a Trinitarian church that holds to a biblical view of what marriage is, historic orthodoxy in that sense, then we're able to come alongside and partner with you.
There's a lot of interesting stuff to get into here. There was something you said earlier about the decline in marriage driving the decline in faith. And I'm curious, which way around does that run? Is the decline in faith causing the decline in marriage? Is it vice versa? Is it a combination? How do you even, how do you weigh that up? How do you measure it?
This is a key question. How you answer it drives, how you approach the solution, right? So first off, there's no doubt that there's what is called bilateral causality. It goes both ways, right? In both an individual sense. Sometimes my friend Mary Eberstadt uses the expression a double helix, that strong marriages and families strengthen faith, and strong faith fosters strong marriages and families. That's absolutely the case. That said, if you look at the United States' experience and you look at the last 70 years of U.S. history, one declined before the other, okay? And you start to have a decoupling of marriage from sex in 1960s, right? Actually, if you actually go back a little bit, right, or a lot, the ideas of the sexual revolution start several hundred years before. I think in the late Enlightenment, around the French Revolution, you have these ideas of man being shackled by the responsibilities of marriage and family. You see this in Rousseau, who famously had 5 children that he all dropped off at an orphanage. Okay, but the ideas of sexual license are limited in scope by technology in a practical sense. Until the 1960s, you have the commercial triumph of artificial contraception, and that technological disruption leads to a decoupling of sex from marriage, which then decouples marriage from parenting and parenting from partnering. And it's that chaotic decoupling that starts to create the relationship trauma that the West is now living through and the United States is now living through. And that starts in 1960, and the fruit, the children of this time period start to become adults in the mid to late 80s, and they start showing up in religious non-affiliation data, right? So what's not debatable is family structure begins to change in the 60s, accelerates in the 70s with the advent of no-fault divorce, and then you start to see religious non-affiliation start to be tracked and growing in the mid to late 80s, early 90s, and so it's my case that in the case of in the instance of the United States over the last 70 years, religious non-affiliation is the effect of largely the effect of the decline of marriage.
That's interesting. And how does it work the other way around?
Yeah, so we know, right, that there's even new research out recently that when somebody's religious faith changes, okay, it does alter their worldview. It alters their politics, for instance. There's a new peer-reviewed paper that's out in recent months that shows when somebody's religious view changes later, it appears, right? The authors are careful not to completely conclude causality, but there's a strong linear correlation where religion changes and then later worldview changes, right? And so there's no doubt that if our religious views can change, and that can change how we view our politics, it's going to change how we view sexual morality. It's going to change how we view view the family, view marriage itself, right? And so there's no doubt that there's a number of folks who in the West who come from intact families, strong families, who fall away from Christian faith. Okay, and it's the falling away itself from faith, even though they come from a strong home, that changes, that further changes their worldview, causes them to deprioritize marriage and go on this, really this, what's described by Carl Trueman in his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, as a poetic journey, this idea of finding meaning inwardly rather than going out and finding meaning externally in things like marriage and family and faith. So it definitely, the lines of causality go in both directions. It's just in terms of the social science and trying to understand the shift in faith on a societal wide level, one declined rapidly before the other, and that was the family declined rapidly before faith declined, and then you started to see faith decline, while on an individual basis, folks that we might know, friends I might have, you see the lines of causality go in the other direction.
Yeah. And for the USA in particular, and this is obviously going to be true across the West and many other developed countries, what has been the consequence? What have been the consequences of this decline in marriage and the decoupling of marriage from procreation, the decoupling of sex from marriage and sex even from procreation, whichever way you want to frame it? Because obviously, we live in a certain era, and there are all sorts of beliefs and views and opinions on there out this, and it ranges from this is terrible, this is an absolute disaster, and this needs to be fixed, to good. This is good. This is what this is what we strive for. This is what we want. All different forms of family structure are equal. Kids don't need both parents. They don't need necessarily a mom or a dad. It could be one mom, one dad, two dads, two moms, like whatever, as long as they're loved, that's fine for children. These are just the things that people say.
Right.
But what is the reality on the ground? How is this actually impacting? Let's take the USA in particular, because, I mean, sadly, I think the USA has the highest rate of children being raised by single mothers in the entire world, which is not a stat that people should be proud of.
Right.
But what are the impacts of that?
Yeah, they're legion. It's all over the place. I mean, boy, if there's time to walk through them, I'll just summarize some of them by starting with a conversation I had with the chief of staff of a U.S. governor of a major state, and this would have been in 2017. This chief of staff said, JP, 80% of our state's spending is the result of the collapse of the family, right? So 80%. And whether it's, incarceration, education, medication, all of those are driven, right? So you spend a lot more time incarcerating, you spend a lot more time trying to overcome the human capital deficit that children without a married mom and dad have, overcoming that deficit in the schoolhouse, and it's really hard for teachers and schools and administrators to be able to do that. And you have lower literacy levels, right? Boys have and girls manifest different behavioral challenges, right? From anger management to boys from unmarried homes are far more likely to be suspended in school and have behavioral issues with their teachers and administrators. Okay.
Just to jump in there quickly,
Yeah.
JP, just to
Yeah.
clarify something, is that unmarried households with both parents, or is that absent father?
Okay, so there's a lot. When you look at in the case of the United States, cohabiting parents, where there's both biological parents present, there is still major outcome differences with married parents. Okay, so it's not enough to have both biological parents there. Okay, what it appears to be is there appears to be a real benefit to the children and to the couple for there to be clarity on the commitment of one partner with the other that comes from marriage that's absent in cohabitation. And as a consequence, cohabiting relationships are less stable. They're far more likely to end in separation, far more likely by the age of 12 when a child is being raised by both biological parents in the same home but not married, far more likely than a married home to end up with separated parents. So a lot of the pathologies that you see in an unmarried home, single mom, is also these pathologies are showing up in homes where there's two biological parents that aren't married. Women and this is important. Glenn Stanton has a phenomenal book called "The Ring Makes the Difference," makes all the difference, and he dives into a lot of the social science around cohabitation, and what he finds is that even controlling for wealth and income, women in a cohabiting relationship are just more likely to be the victims of violence. Children are as well, even in a cohabiting situation when the biological father's present. Okay, so while it may be better for the biological father to be present than not present, it's better still that the biological father be married to the mother of his children, right? And we know, and I know, especially in my family member's case, that's not always going to be possible because of the situation of the father, situation of the mother, but that doesn't stop us from pointing out what's ideal and what we should and ought to be striving to both as a society and when you talk to young people, helping them understand, what's likely to lead to their own personal happiness and flourishing. Zuby, I coach American football, high school football, and I volunteer doing that, and it's a evangelical Christian team, and we have devotionals once a week. And the first time I led a devotional, put a lot of work in and thought I did a great job. And then the next time I did it, I was in a pinch and didn't know what to speak on as I was driving to the field and said, what do I know? I know about marriage. So I spoke to 14, 18-year-old boys about marriage because and fundamentally, it's what's going to, the thing that's going to be most likely to make them happy and thriving in life. I asked them a question. Look, when you look back at your life, what do you think is going to cause you to be more happy, right? Maybe you drive a Bugatti. Maybe you're going to drive a supercar. How many of you are going to raise your hand for that? Or making a lot of money, or having this incredible job, or fame, maybe being famous, maybe having a great degree so that you can have a fulfilling career. Different kids raise their hands, and I say to them, what if I told you that all those things might be good things, right? Maybe good things, but none of those things compare to the personal fulfillment and happiness that comes from having a happy marriage. The thing that's most likely to produce the most enduring happiness, flourishing satisfaction in your life is being married and being a parent. And if that's true, I ask these boys, then what do I think it's important right now, you're 14, 15, through 18, what are you doing now to make yourself ready so that you can be a good dad, be a good husband, right? And discern a marriage well when the time comes, right? I got more more positive feedback from that from parents than anything I ever said about defensive alignment and offensive play calling than in my time of coaching.
Yeah, gosh, I have so many thoughts on this subject. It's something that I've spent probably absurd amount of time thinking about and talking about with people from all different walks of life. And something that is very, very true, and this is kind of part of the problem. It's part of the solution potentially, but also part of the problem. And this is simply that divorce, broken families, absent parents, and even bad marriages are so common now, particularly in the US and across the West, that if I look at my own generation, for example, I would think that probably 50% of people around my age in the USA and perhaps in the UK as well are coming from some type of broken family. And in many of those scenarios, lots of the people they know as well, their other family members, their friends, and so on, it's similar. Many people I know who come from, parents married for life and they're living in certain communities, and almost everyone they know and everyone they grow up with, they've seen tons and tons of successful marriages. Like I've spoken to people who, like everyone they know and everyone in their family, so on, like, everyone's married and people are happy and it's successful. And I've spoken to people who have they're 30 something years old and they've never even seen a marriage work out. And so I have empathy for someone who's in that situation, for believing and behaving in some of the ways that they may. There are people who come from that and they're like, nope, it doesn't matter. I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it properly, and I'm not going to do what my parents did or my uncle or my auntie or so on. But as we know, just as human behavior, people tend to repeat patterns, and people tend to do whatever they're acclimatized to and that they feel is sort of quote unquote normal. And then when you add to the fact that you have a society and a culture, everything from the media to movies to just the rhetoric, social media, all of that, there is so much just anti-marriage, anti-family, anti-anything remotely conservative or Christian or so on. Like, there's just so much of it that it's a real uphill battle. And whilst I myself I'm certainly a Christian, and I could be described as a Christian conservative, certainly by Western standards, I myself sometimes get a little bit bothered by the sort of messaging of just like, hey, everyone, like, just get married, just have a bunch of kids. Like there are people who say it as if it's just like, people have no hurdles, and it's kind of just like it's just boom, just marry your high school sweetheart and have 11 kids. I'm like, God bless you. God bless you if like you're in the position to do that. But most people, if we're just being realistic, are not. So many people are coming from different types of brokenness. A lot of people are not even of faith to begin with. So even when we say the word marriage, actually I want to loop back to this question, because even when we just say the word marriage, it means different things to different people. For some people, they're thinking of like a godly covenant. They're thinking of like explicitly Christian or religious marriage, which is truly, till death do us apart. And there's certain roles that come with that and certain expectations. Other people, it just means like, a certificate from the government that two adults, they don't even need to be a man and a woman, are kind of coming into some legal agreement. And if someone is
temporary, comfort made.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. So it's like we're not even kind of speaking.
Sure.
We're not even necessarily speaking the same language, and it's kind of funny. I mean, I'm married myself, and my parents have been married for 50 years. All of my siblings are married. We all have kids. Like, I come from a tradition of very stable marriages, and I've had people who, just by me sort of asking some of these questions in podcasts or having empathy for certain positions, I've had people be like, oh, Zuby is like against marriage, or Zuby's anti-marriage. I'm like, no, not at all. I just understand other people's perspectives. So if I'm talking to a young man or even a young woman who's like, oh, I don't believe in marriage, or like, I don't want to do something, like, I'm not going to just chastise them. Like, I'm curious as to where they're coming from. And oftentimes they have genuinely understandable reasons for holding that position. And I don't think it's particularly effective to kind of beat them over the head with this rhetoric or try to kind of shame them into it, because even if that somehow worked short term, it's unlikely to work long term, and that could just lead to even more brokenness and more problems. So I've said a lot there. I'm curious to know what you think of that.
Yeah, no, for, just to echo what you've shared, a friend of mine works, a good friend of mine, Alicia Lahaz. She runs a great ministry in Chicago and works in very tough zip codes. The ministry is called Lazos de Familia, Family Bridges. And she told me about this time her and her husband went to speak at an inner city school. And she got up and introduced herself and then introduced her husband and said, "This is my husband," and goes on. And then she goes into her talk, and a couple minutes in, a little girl raises her hand, and she calls on her, and the little girl says, "What's a husband?" And she had never seen or experienced somebody who had been married in her zip code, in her neighborhood, right? This is one of the major points that we make to churches, that we have to recognize that we're in a state of anthropological anarchy and we're experiencing a cultural revolution. And winsomeness alone isn't going to overcome it. We actually have to equip our people to know what a healthy Christian relationship looks like, and know how to seek it and discern it and know how to form it and enter into it, right? We frequently, we just expect young people to present themselves. If we're in a church setting, they'll just present themselves when they're ready to be married, and then we can do marriage preparation if we do that, and then, after they get married, good luck to you, and if you have problems, let us know. Okay, that's basically the extent of Christian formation as it relates to it. And that is within people who are committed to a biblical worldview, right? Let alone everybody else, right? And so it's absolutely critical. I co-wrote a book, Endgame, and with a phenomenal guy, Dr. John Van App, and he's a psychologist, also a former pastor. He's a committed evangelical Christian. And he brings, one of the reasons we wrote the book together is he brings some of the best brain science and psychology to the table in these conversations, right? Augustine, I love Augustine's line that all truth is God's truth. So we don't have to be hostile to truth as believers. And he notes that there's 5 dynamics of human attachment that imagine a soundboard, right? And you have on the soundboard 5 knobs from left to right. You got know, trust, rely, commit, touch. As we go through this in the book, this is what he calls the relationship attachment model, right? So imagine the knob on the left is know, then to the right is trust, rely, commit, touch, right? And so the point is, no knob on the right should ever be higher than a knob on the left, right? We teach, when I talk to young people about this, or we teach relationships and dating to folks. And what happens frequently is, what does the world want us to do? Well, the world wants you to
opposite.
Move, right. You move sexual touch to the top. And the point that we make to young people is each dynamic psychologically are not independent of each other. That each dynamic has a bonding effect and affects the other. So once you move sexual touch to the top, even if you think, and you've been told the lie that it's just a bodily function no different than a sneeze, the reality is once you move to sexual touch, you start to rely and trust someone, okay? Psychologically, you start to bond, okay? And you don't yet know, and you're not yet committed to them, okay? So if we want to understand why the mental health crisis is so explosive, is one of the big factors is people are giving away a huge part of their psychological self to somebody that's permanent, that's intended to be permanent, and it's being done in a throwaway way. So people are trusting and relying on people that they have no business trusting and relying on. They feel empty, they're hurt, okay, as a result of what comes out of that. And it's not merciful or charitable to hide this from people and just say not everybody knows and has had a good example of marriage. What we need to do is, because they don't have, actually is all the more important, because they don't have the good example, how do we equip people? How do we teach them a healthy pathway so that they can know what if they've had bad examples in their family, no examples in their family. Okay, how do we speak into that? And it's all the more important. I'm hopeful, Zuby, because there's over 100,000 churches in the United States of 100 or more people. Right? There's 82% of them are spending nothing in the area of marriage and relationship education. And I think I love C.S. Lewis's quote. I'll probably butcher it here, which is put first things first, and you get second things thrown in. But if you put second things first, you lose both first and second things. The reality is frequently in the place of the church we're not putting first things first. We're putting second things or third things first, and we're losing everything before it. Right? Our church partners are seeing some really great fruitfulness by speaking into this first thing, by helping folks who are not yet even believers, helping them uncover and understand the source of maybe their unhappiness, the recurring brokenness in their relationships, their friendships, the women or men that they're with. And then you start to help someone get in a good spot, and that stop those repeated steps that lead to trauma, and then get themselves in a good spot. Once that happens, that's what we say. That's the stable soil, right? Faith can grow in a stable. It's much easier for faith to grow in a stable soil. But when the soil's chaotic, when the relationships around us, the family trauma is so significant, it's really hard to experience the love, say, of an earthly father. And when we don't experience the love of an earthly father, it's really hard to believe that there's this heavenly Father who so loves us that he sent his son to die for us, right? Marriage is God's gift to all humanity. That's pretty clear. It's in all cultures and places, okay? And I believe that's because it's God's covenantal sign of his love for us, right? There's the deep nuptial meaning of Scripture is everywhere. It's in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden. It's there at the end in the eschatological wedding feast in the garden, in heaven. You see it from the minor to major prophets. It's in the Psalms. It's in the Song of Solomon. We see it in Paul's writings, where he lays out the great mystery, where the love of a husband and wife is a sign of God's love, Christ's love for his church. And so it's no doubt, it's not a surprise that the evil one has so sought to obliterate the great gift, the covenantal sign that God gave to all humanity of his love for us. The evil one has gone after that. And as a consequence, as that's teetered and begun to fall in places, you see religious non-affiliation grow. You see less and less people accepting the divine love story of God's love for humanity. So I think it's a great opportunity, right? I'm not a doomer. I'm an optimist. I think that we know who wins, and I think the church has the answers and can share those answers to help people live a life that is life-giving and that leads to flourishing and happiness.
Yeah. Why do you think it is that so many churches have essentially abdicated from this area? I mean, you said over 80% of churches in the U.S., according to your data, don't invest at all in this area. I mean, that seems like quite a bizarre oversight to me. And it seems like the consequences are pretty obvious. Yeah,
pretty massive. And that data comes from a Barna study that we commissioned of Protestant and Catholic churches across the United States. And I think the big reason is that frequently the church is a phenomenal firefighting team. Okay, if you think about the church in the history of the first millennia was focused on trying to define who Jesus Christ is. Okay, the first 7 councils of the ancient church. And in different ways, the church responds to times of crisis. When there's a question, she responds. In the United States, one of the earliest challenges that we had was we were widespread alcoholics in the United States. Actually, we consumed, the estimate is that the average American consumed 1,500 milliliters of 80-proof alcohol every week. Okay, every American every week. Okay, European, Tocqueville writes about seeing a 7-year-old stumbling drunk in a city square. Another European of that same period says that Americans drink from the crack of dawn until the crack of dawn. Okay, and so, well, what happened then? The church responded to that crisis with the temperance movement, and the fruit of the Second Great Awakening, and not through prohibition. It was by the 1880s, alcohol consumption had dropped by over 70%. Okay, the most common form of the most common ingredient to crime in the 19th century was being intoxicated, and so prisons actually closed in the late half of the 19th century because so many fewer people were committing crimes because so many fewer people were intoxicated. Okay, so the church responded to that crisis, right? So I say those things by way of understanding that we're now we're experiencing something new, legitimately something new, right? The decoupling effects I laid out in the 60s, it's a long time, but in the course of the life of the church, it's a blink of an eye, and so now the church has to respond to the present anthropological anarchy, has to respond to this cultural revolution, and we tell our partners we have to have a metanoia. This is a word from the Gospels, from the first phrase recorded in Mark's Gospel of what Jesus says. Metanoia means, it's translated in English as repent, but it really better means transformation, like complete change, do a 180. And our point to pastors is we need to have a metanoia in how we think about ministry in this moment, right? And I think what's happened is a lot of times pastors think that if we exclusively share the gospel and call people to repentance, that it will produce the good human fruit from the good spiritual fruit. And that's true. Okay, I'm not dismissing that. God transforms lives all the time. Our point is also that it does seem that God is the author of human history, he's the author of our humanity, and it appears that he made marriage and relationships to be the normative path for us to understand his love for us. And so if that is true, and it appears to be biblically true for sure, then we need to understand that the best path to beginning in a time of relationship nihilism and relationship anarchy, then one of the best things we can do to share the good news is to help people understand what authentic Christian relationships look like and don't look like, and help them form them. Okay, so I think in a lot of ways the church hasn't engaged because this is something new, and we need to respond to this something new. And that's why why I formed Communio is to actually mobilize churches to understand this is the battle for our time, right? This is in the 21st century. This is the great fight for us to undertake.
Yeah, I want to soon talk a little more specifically about what Communio does and has done, but before that, I think it might sound like a strange question, but I think it's so important because, as I've said, the word means different things to different people. But when we say marriage, what are we even talking about? Yeah,
look, we're talking about in the Christian context. We mean a lifelong relationship and sacrificial commitment of husband to wife and wife to husband. Husbands living a sacrificial life, laying down their lives for their wives. Living sacrificially, and wives living sacrificially for their husbands. And in Ephesians 5:21, the apostle writes, "Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ." Okay, and so there is within the Christian context, there's both. We're not the same, okay, which is a rejection of modernity's idea that men and women, the differences don't matter. We're not the same, but we have an equality of dignity, right? That we, husbands are to love their wives in a way that is it represents the way Christ loved the church, okay? And that is a really tough thing to do, to live out each day, right? And it's easy, I say to men, it's easy for us to lay down our lives, for our wives when there's an attacker and an assailant who comes into the home. We see that. When we see it in the extreme, it's easy for us to quickly respond to. Okay? It's harder in the smaller things to die. Husband and wives ought to die to themselves in all the small ways. In my context, and I'm not a believer in that this problem is a one-way problem, right? That this is just a problem of men or just a problem of women. I think this is there's problems on both sides of the street, and to solve it, we need to get back to an idea of complementarity, that we need each other. One of the big lies of modernity is this idea that we need to be independent, right? You want your son or daughter to be independent, and no species is more dependent than a human, right? We're when we're born, it takes us 18 years or more to get on our own. It takes a hamster 21 days, right? Like
closer to 30 now.
Yeah, right. And so we need, in different ways, who do we enter into a relationship where we depend on someone else? And how do we discern that well? And what does it mean for, someone else is going to depend on us, our children, our spouse, and they should, and vice versa, right? And so, anyways, helping folks discern that well, live that well is mission critical. But yeah, marriage at a baseline definition is a man and woman living in a complementary way, sacrificially for each other, and Christian marriage understands, and why it can't be anything other than a husband and wife is because Christian marriage images the church and Christ's relationship with her. Okay, Christ is the bridegroom, the church is the bride. Okay, and in Ephesians 5 we see that the husband is that living example in the marriage of Christ for his wife. Okay, and too frequently men don't live that out well, and too frequently brides don't live out what being an authentic bride of Christ should be. Okay, and having that mutual, as Paul says, mutual submission, that to being subject to one another out of reverence for Christ, right? That's a key line that goes through. He says that at the onset of explaining everything else in his discourse on marriage. When he directs everything to women and then everything to men, it lives underneath that passage. That he says that at the onset, then he talks to women, then he talks to men. And he uses language that is hostile to the modern mind because he's using complementary language rather than the language of the late Enlightenment, and radical egalite is not the language on his mind. He has equality, certainly of dignity between in the human person is definitely there.
Yeah. See, part of the reason I asked that question is because I personally think that one of the problems that we have when we're having these discussions, just generally as a society and as a culture, is that I believe that the word marriage now is semantically overloaded to the point of confusion. So what you just described obviously is a biblical Christian marriage. But marriage can also just mean a simple legal status, which doesn't come with all of those burdens and expectations and level of commitment and so on. And sometimes I find in conversations, and both Christians and non-Christians can do this, people kind of flip-flop back and forth between the two definitions, right? So on one hand, someone will be talking about covenantal marriage, and then they'll, halfway through the conversation, they'll switch and start just talking about the kind of like secular legal marriage. And I don't think people generally do this intentionally, but like they're kind of going, like, for all intents and purposes, they're pretty different things. They can go hand in hand,
Yeah.
but they don't they don't necessarily, right? So, two
Yeah.
people can get, and it's all covered in the same data. Do you see what I mean? Right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
just
yeah. And I think it's important for us
it-
to, totally recognize that
yeah.
natural marriage, one of the points I noticed natural marriage was God's gift to all humanity. What I described was Christian marriage, right? Which was elevated in the gospel and elevated in Paul's epistles. But marriage preexists that, right? Two non-Christians can have a loving and beautiful natural marriage, right? That said, we would, as a Christian, we would argue for a natural law understanding of what that should be, but we understand that there's a complete, there's not universal acceptance of what natural law is in today's postmodern world, and so there's definitely, I think it's worthwhile, and I think Christians, we can do a better job of speaking with some precision what we mean when we say marriage, whether it's Christian marriage or natural marriage or some when society starts to redefine it as something else, I think it's important for us to note that that's a deviation from natural marriage, and it doesn't mean we need to be uncharitable about it, but we don't. We also don't need to, at the end of the day, natural marriage and Christian marriage have this in common. They have the natural effect of being life-giving. That doesn't mean that there aren't naturally infertile marriages, of course, and it doesn't mean that Christians didn't recognize that, for instance, two elderly people in the ancient church, there was a recognition that two elderly people who are widowers and widows could marry, and there wouldn't be children. That was understood and permitted. So none of that denies the general ingredient that natural marriage ought to be unitive. It ought to unite the two in love and be and also be procreative. That there's the opportunity for life to come about.
Given all of that, should the government be involved? And if so, to what degree?
Yeah, this is a big question, particularly on the American right, became a big question. I don't think we have a choice. Okay, I guess I'm a major realist on this. There's the state recognized marriage largely because you've got the reality of children and property. Okay, and who owns it and how it conveys the reality of probate and passing on goods and resources, right? It's an easy thing for folks to say we should privatize marriage and the state shouldn't be involved in marriage. That ignores one. I would argue it ignores nature. Okay, when a child's the best place for a child is to be with his married parents. When that's absent, a child ought to be placed into a home of two other loving married parents, and that should be the preference of the state. And so once we take an agnostic view, where it's like it doesn't really matter, we are saying we'll get the state out of this. It actually creates a lot more. I would argue it'll create much more problems than it's intended to solve, and actually a lot of the worst parts of family law in the United States, which varies significantly state to state, and also even in its application county to county in some states, are deviation. Right? In many ways, American family law, where it's really problematic, it's because it's rejected the tenets of both natural and Christian marriage. And it takes a bit of an agnostic approach, and the solution is to probably to repair that, and not to. I would be concerned, and I am concerned about the continuing disintegration of that and its likely impact on society. I understand the sort of libertarian desire in maybe getting the state out of it, but I think in a lot of like a lot of libertarian solutions, it hasn't grappled fully with the reality of what would happen if we fully embrace that.
Yeah, I hear that. It's interesting. I mean, I don't know why. Maybe you have an idea about this one, but I find that as much as conservatives, and especially Christian conservatives, push and promote marriage and want to encourage it, I find that most people are strangely shy or don't want to tackle the whole family law and courts issue, which is a major issue for millions of people.
Yeah.
It seems obvious to me that, okay, if you want to encourage people to get married, certainly in certain states, in certain parts of the country, in certain parts of the world in general, you have to reform. You have to reform some of these laws.
Yeah.
I know plenty of men and even a few women who are like, they're like under these conditions.
It's terrible.
The risk reward ratio is not looking so good for me. And again, the normal reaction is for people to want to like shame these people to like label them or to try to say, and I'm just like, that's very counterproductive, because many people who are very pro-marriage and they're marriage advocates, they themselves will actually recognize that
have been treated very
like the whole
terribly.
They'll recognize that it's a problem, but I don't see any real movement or serious conversation being had of like, okay, some of these laws need to change, because you've got this one foot in sort of the way things used to be. There's like one foot in traditionalism, and then there's another foot in like a very progressive, like, no fault divorce, and marriages can be exited for any reason, whatever. But also, if you're a man in particular, like, we're going to really punish, even if you
you're financially ruined and your kids are kidnapped from you.
Yes, you
Be
put it very simply, right?
Like, we just want to be very direct.
Yes,
So
thank you for that, because most people won't be, and people act like that's not something that happens, and it does, and it has happened to millions and millions of people. So I don't think it's unreasonable for someone to be like, wait, hang on, I don't want to do that. Even if the risk of that happening is like, relatively low, like that shouldn't be the consequence of this. Like, that doesn't seem just, that doesn't seem fair. So I don't know why more people, I love the fact that you just say it as it is, but I don't know why so few people do.
Right.
Maybe because they think it'll like discourage people from getting married, so they don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on.
I think it's so important that we are realists on this stuff. It's a real thing. Men are legitimately, and it's worth noting that the men are more frequently on the shorthand of the custody and finance stick in a separation. Right, 70% of all divorces are initiated by women still. Okay, in the United States. Kentucky, I will note, made a reform to their divorce laws that leveled the playing field. All it did was fundamentally set the state up as men and women, husbands and wives, moms and dads are equal before the law as it relates to custody and alimony, and that one. The one change that they did in Kentucky led to a 24% statewide decline in divorce. Okay.
Boom. Look at that.
So there are things that can and should be done. Of course, look, what you want to do is create legal protections when there's no one should be in an unsafe home. Okay. If it's a fundamentally unsafe home. This is personally very important to me because of how I got into this area. That said, the vast majority of divorces are not the result of physical violence or abuse. In fact, 70% of all divorces are considered low conflict divorces. Okay, these are divorces where there's a solution can be found. The old joke was that back in the era of cable contracts, TV contracts here, it was easier to get out of your marriage than your cable contract. And so that shouldn't be the case. Okay. If the solution, certainly there's reform to family law that needs to happen, whether it's, and I think you can get there. I think you can make major improvements without even a full frontal on no fault divorce, but certainly no fault divorce is a major problem. But there's significant improvements that you can make without touching on that. We all have friends. If are friends with married people, then of good people who have had a terrible situation in a divorce that they didn't want, where there was no abuse, there was no neglect, and one of the parties was lost access to the children because you have to legally set up 2 domiciles, and then if you have 4 kids or 5 kids or 3 kids, you have to have a certain number of bedrooms, and if the law is going to require you to have a certain number of bedrooms to be able to have your kids stay with you, then and you also have to pay for them to be supported somewhere else. It's just a math problem. You're not going to have a lot of dads involved in the life of their children. So I think ignoring that, I think you're right, Zuby, is not super helpful. But I lean into that and say, look, that's a real thing, right? Okay, well, what is the situation on divorce in the United States? The reality is, according to the best research out there, probably we're looking at about somewhere between 35 and 38% of all first-time marriages will end in divorce. Okay, first-time marriages will. So it's usually the term is half of all marriages end in divorce. When you look at first-time marriages, it's much lower than that. The number, once you start adding up all divorces, because there's folks who are serial divorcers, okay, which skews the numbers. So what that means is, on a good news, most marriages will last a lifetime. Actually, close to 2/3 will last a lifetime. And the reality is those who are happily married are the happiest people in all of society. And I can tell you, in our nationwide study on faith and relationships, any of your listeners can download it. We go into we survey churchgoers on using the UCLA Loneliness Index. The loneliest people in a church, and this is important before I even give the stat, if you're considered lonely by this UCLA Loneliness Index definition, you're likely to live 15 years shorter. Okay, you're likely to have really much worse public health outcomes. It's the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Okay. So with that said, the loneliest people in church by this definition are the unmarried in their 30s. Okay, both the never married and the divorced are the loneliest in church, and they're lonelier than the loneliest group of widows. The loneliest group of widows statistically in the survey are widows and widowers in their 50s. And that makes sense because that was, they should be married statistically speaking, but one of them died much earlier than might be normative. But even that group is less lonely on average than the never married and the unmarried. So this is what I have to say to those who use this fear as a cudgel to avoid marriage and avoid commitment. So there's danger and suffering wherever you go. On this side of the eschaton, on this side of heaven, nobody's getting out of this alive. Okay, and there's suffering. The question is would you rather have a life that you can suffer with someone, where that suffering can be life-giving, rather than life-taking and life-destroying? Okay, the best chance of that is to pursue a life of marriage, and I understand it can be hard. Okay, so we're not here to pretend that it's not, and we can help you get the skills and know how to enter marriage well, and know how to increase the likelihood that we avoid a really problematic marriage, a really problematic relationship.
Yeah, I think these are all areas that to me are just so under-discussed. Again, like for a man, how do you vet? How do you select a good wife? And then in the relationship, in the marriage, what do you do? How are you meant to behave to make things as successful as possible? And then same the other way around. I feel like historically, And even to this day, in many, many cultures, I'd actually say in most non-Western cultures, people get and they learn this advice from their parents and grandparents and
Yeah.
aunties and uncles and
Yeah.
communities and religious institutions and so on. There's a lot of tutoring and guidance. And in the modern West, it's
Right.
very kind of Wild West. It's just like,
It's whatever
all right,
Cosmo or People magazine has,
yeah.
You
It's
know.
like let's just kind of like throw young people into
Right.
from teenage years,
Right.
Right. You're just gonna have I love the term you used. I think you said like relational anarchy or something. We're just gonna have like anarchy, and then we're gonna add technology to it now to make it even more complicated.
Yeah.
And we're just gonna kind of like hope that by magic, it works out, and all of these 20-somethings and 30-somethings just sort of magically end up it working out and them being. And I'm just like that. You don't approach anything else that way. We don't approach education that way.
No.
We don't approach the job market that way.
Math.
We don't approach
maybe they're going to learn math. Maybe they won't learn math. I don't know. It's just whatever makes them like. We want our kids to learn math. Why? I mean, like it's 100%. You don't. A great book for any of your listeners, if they're interested in really just understanding how to discern and like, hey, is this person right for me? Is this a good person for me? How to avoid falling in love with a jerk. Written by my co-author, Dr. John Van App. It's a great book. I read it to my kids, my teenagers. We do read alouds. And I got the book. I told the three oldest ones, I said, listen, it's too late for your mom, but it's not too late for you. And so I read them the book. And it just, lots of little things, right? Ask yourself a question. How does this person treat those closest to her, right? So if you're a guy trying to discern a woman or vice versa, okay? How does she treat her parents, her closest friends, right? Be a student and observer of that over time. And really you need some time to observe that, okay? John, the author, John Van Epps advises a 2-year period where you just kind of observe, like in dating and courtship. I know that's not always, it can be certainly faster. His point is you want to see someone go through seasons of life and see how they treat those closest to them in every situation. Because the reality is she will not treat you on average better than she will treat her closest loved ones, okay, and closest friends. So if there is an inability for her to have emotional intimacy, friendship, and a healthy relationship with those people on a long enough time horizon, okay, when the auditioning is done, it returns to the mean, okay? She will treat you the same way, right? That's an example of something to be observant of. Is when you're with this person, are you a better version of yourself or are you a worse version of yourself, okay? That's a big question. Are you tending towards worse vices as a result of that relationship, or are you starting to improve and maybe overcome some of those vices, right? The reality is we're not going to when we're with someone, we're not going to remain the same. Okay, we'll change in some way, either for the worse or for the better. Observing that, right? And if you're getting worse, then exit the relationship. Okay. Looking at just because a person is from a family that's not intact doesn't mean that you shouldn't date or marry them. But being aware that family trauma for all of us is something that we carry in to our relationships, okay? And so then in those situations for all of us, it's important for us to practice the skills of having a healthy relationship. There's an entire field, Zuby, of marriage and relationship education that is that's well defined. There's 5 interpersonal skill areas that we can know and practice, and 5 intrapersonal skill areas, right? Those on the interpersonal side, you're talking about communication, conflict resolution, emotional intimacy, togetherness skills, and even the ability to manage your relationship itself is itself a skill. And then internally, right, our interior life has to be developed, right? That's the personal skills, right? One of the best is appreciation, right? Learning to appreciate somebody, right? This is part of, for the Christians, as part of the spiritual walk, is developing a habit of gratitude, right? In all things, right? Being able to discern healthiness or lack of healthiness in how someone treats people. Self-control. Reality is in any relationship, we need to have self-control. And that actually obviously means sexual self-control also. It's not the only thing, but that's part of it, right? People think that, if you're married, if you're a guy that just means sex all the time, okay, the reality is for instance, the nature of a woman's body is that she shouldn't be having sex all the time, okay, for a variety of many good health reasons, okay? So it's being able to live a life of healthy chastity within marriage, right? And the reality is those people who have the most sex in America, based on the General Social Survey, are church-going married men and women, have more sex than anybody, okay? So that chastity lived out well also leads to a healthier and happier sex life. Expectation management, right? And commitment. Those are the other two intrapersonal skills. And expectation. So much of relationship dissatisfaction is sometimes it's described as betrayal, and I don't mean betrayal, Zuby, in the sense of like someone cheating on somebody. Okay, I mean betrayal in a betrayal of the say the brand promise of marriage. Like, I expected marriage to be this, and it's something, this is not at all what I expected. Okay.
Yes.
So helping people set shared expectations is something we can do, and help people develop the skills to be able to do it. And then that last one is that commitment, that the idea that is this person, one, am I practicing the idea that I'm committed to this person, right? That I don't just exit the relationship because dinner wasn't hot, or because we didn't have he didn't put away the laundry, or we are practicing commitment. This idea that this is to death do us part in a healthy way, and so I'm going to help. That commitment leads me back to practicing and understanding appreciation, setting good expectations, resolving conflict in a healthy way, right? All those things can be practiced, and those things are, for those interested, laid out in my book Endgame, co-written with John Van App, and John's separate book, which is a phenomenal one, How to Avoid Falling in Love with a Jerk. It's a good really, it's a great title. It's been a long time. Amazon, highly ranked on Amazon.
Awesome. Well, we've touched on some of the solutions, but obviously with your work with Communio, how did you achieve what you did in Jacksonville, and how will you use that as a sort of template or example going forward?
Yeah, what we recognize is life changes through personal relationship, and so what we want to do is scale the number of life-changing personal relationships that exist in a local level. We think churches have a superpower in having these kinds of strong social capital, one-to-one personal relationships, and then through the context of that relationship, delivering evidence-based skills ministry. Okay, that's a big word there. Evidence-based means it's not just a Christian feel-good program where someone's lecturing to you. There's actually evidence that marriages get better, that marriages are saved as a result of this. So is there independent research behind it? We found programs that did have that and scaled that. The largest one, most frequently, while we had 58,912 units of people who went through skills ministry in the county in 3 years. So a lot, heavily focused on the 22 to 45-year-old demographic, and almost all of it was evidence-based skills ministry, and the stuff like the Marriage Course by Alpha, which created by my friends Nikki and Scylla Lee, but then also Adventures in Marriage, created by my friend Richard Albertson. That was probably the single most effective program we use. We're helping Richard scale that particular program through our church partners around the country. We're getting hundreds of churches certified on it.
What did you say that one's called?
Called Adventures in Marriage. Adventures in Marriage.
Okay.
You learn 4 tools and you practice those tools. There's an explanation, so sort of an instruction around the brain science and psychology and theology around the tool. Then they demonstrate the tool, and then you practice using the tool. And then the tool's set up in such a way that it's easy for you to keep doing throughout your marriage. And one of them that we use my wife and I use is the daily temperature reading, which is a structured way just to reconnect. It's so easy with our darn smartphones, and you know, we have 8 kids ourselves, and like we're sort of shuttling kids from practice to tutoring to games, and just life happens. And so it can be really easy for all of our conversations as married people just to always sit at the base level, which is, okay, what's for dinner? Like, who's doing what? When do we pay that bill? Stuff
Logistics.
that just is the stuff you got to do, and it never elevates past that. So the daily temperature reading is a helpful tool that helps a couple. You can do it in 10 minutes, you can do it in 20 minutes, you can do it in 30 minutes. Simple way to reconnect on substantive things, to connect on things that may be bothering you, so that you set expectations on things that are bothering you. It brings you back in a closing way to praying together as a couple. So it's a really simple tool that it's one of the 4 that if you can get right side on your relationship, you know, if you're stuck and you get right side, then this becomes a great way to have ongoing relationship maintenance. So we recognize. So in Jacksonville, it was that the proliferation of those skills. We ran digital marketing and outreach across the county, saturating the county, focusing on people who, based on our micro-targeting data, we suspected were in more likely to be struggling in their marriage, and drew those people into churches, and then the divorce rate dropped 24%. So what we've done since then, and how we work, is we call our model the data-informed full circle relationship ministry, and that is our process that we coach churches on. When we work with a church, we work with them for 3 years, typically, many times longer, but we're coaching the church to have a transformative ministry. And so we say, look, we didn't get into this place because of the devil didn't use a $499 kit, anti-family kit, or a 6-week anti-family sermon series. Okay, so we're not going to get out of the problem through our own $499 kit or 6-week series. Okay, those can be part of the solution, but the solution in this area has to be comprehensive across the whole church, affecting everybody from youth to young adults, to the single, to the married. Everybody deserves and should know how to have healthy relationships, what they look like, what a healthy marriage looks like. You can do it in a way. We don't have to be fearful of the relationship trauma that people have experienced. We can actually speak into it with realism and hope to help people live out life well, without being judgmental by while still holding up the ideal of Christian marriage. And so we help churches do that, have that mindset shift, that metanoia on relationship, so it becomes a full church ministry. You know, I give 2 quick examples of a great church, Mountain View, out in Bozeman, Montana. One of our great partners, a phenomenal pastor out there, heavily a young adult church. Before we started, there were about 100 people coming to that church each week, and Pastor Grant there caught the vision of understanding that the relationship trauma is the major evangelizing opportunity of our present moment to share the gospel. Really leaned into that with young people, started to attract a lot more young people as a result to his already young church, and they've grown. They're now, and it's not only because of Communio, it's his own dynamism, and there's a lot going on in Bozeman, but they're now at about 210 to 220 people coming each week, about a little less than 2 years in. They're having these, they had this couple, David and Leah at their church, who were cohabiting, showed up because they did this great fun engagement, leveraging, applying our our approach. They went out backpacking in Montana, a big outdoor activity. This young 20-something couple started coming. They had been unchurched. They started to come to faith, started getting involved in ministry. And then Grant, God bless him, leaned in and had a Holy Spirit-led conversation, a couple of them, about what Christian marriage is and what it looks like. They said, yeah, we want that. And they ended up getting married. And they were prepared well for marriage by him. And so you're seeing when churches lean into this, you see more marriages, and then you see marriages saved. I think of another church that we work with in Vero Beach, Florida, where they have a school, and the school had a relationship ministry contest, and the couple was getting divorced. There was a couple getting divorced, and the teacher, there was a teacher getting divorced, and nobody had known it. They went to a parenting class through the ministry, and that we helped them set up. It softened their hearts. The husband said, maybe we should go to the marriage retreat the church is sponsoring. They did. They had a complete transformation in their relationship. They've recommitted to their marriage. They've now joined the leadership team at the church to run the ministry. And they have 3 young kids in the school that are that get to have a great home life again, and because this church leaned in. So lives change when churches do this, okay? And so our big thing is, Zuby, no individual or couple will ever come to a Communio program. We 100% are B2B. We support the local church. That's how we've structured our model. And so we coach the church to do ministry really well.
JP, man, it's been awesome talking to you. I appreciate your understanding, your real empathy, and your candor and honesty with this. I think it's such an important topic, and I'm glad that you're just leading into it, and instead of just saying things, getting in there and genuinely helping people. So I admire and I respect and appreciate that. So thank you.
Enjoy being with you. Thank you so much for having me.